You are listening to Rootbound, a podcast about plants for when you're stuck inside.
Flowers just smell darn good, am I right? Well, that is thanks to our sponsor for this episode of Rootbound, Fragrance. So next time you stop to smell the roses, thank Fragrance. Ah, smells good.
Listen. I'm standing here in the middle of a forest near my home in Virginia. This is Steve, by the way, the host of the podcast, but you probably already knew that. But yes, I'm standing here in a forest, and that sound that you're hearing is the sound of water droplets filtering through the leaves of the trees. Now, it was just raining quite a bit, but it's actually not raining anymore. This is just the remnants of the water coming from the top of the canopy down to the forest floor. I'm actually not getting wet right now either, because most of the water, it seems, is making its way, filtering down to the trunks and running down the trunks of the trees. So it's quite a moment right now. But why am I in a forest at the moment? Well, it's because it is pawpaw season, and I'm out on the hunt for the elusive pawpaw. But this is not the pawpaw episode. We did that a while back. Go ahead and give that a listen. I'll put a link in the show notes. But there's a spider web. When you're in the forest at this time of year, very early, you have to make sure that you don't walk right in the middle of a spider web. How do I get through you, little buddy? Okay, here we go. Thank you. Sorry. So, yes, I'm searching for the elusive pawpaw. Go back and listen to that episode. I'll put a link in the show notes. But this is not the pawpaw episode. We're going to be talking about a different plant today, and we're only going to be talking about one plant. We have a really special guest, and I wanted to do more of these episodes where we talk about just one plant, but it's not something from my secret list of plants. This is not a plant that I have a lot of connection to, or at least I didn't think I did. So this is going to be a really fun episode. I'm really excited to meet our guest. She's just a font of knowledge. If you're on Instagram, you may know her as Blue Ridge Botanic. So let's meet her. But first, let's just listen to a little bit more of these lovely forest sounds. Hi, Nina. Thank you for joining me on this episode of Rootbound.
Hi there.
So this is a little bit of a different episode because we're only going to be talking about one plant, but this is not a plant that I actually have super connection with, but I know, Nina, that you know a lot about this plant, and it's something I'm very curious about. So, Nina, would you like to share what plant we're going to talk about today on this episode of Rootbound?
Sure. We are going to talk about violets.
Cool. I'm very excited about this because it's one of these plants later I'll talk about it. I realized recently there's actually something that actually is quite meaningful to me about this plant, but I didn't realize it till recently. But other than that, I don't really have a lot of connection to it, but I'm very curious. And also, I looked up a few fun facts and dazzling details that I'm hoping maybe I can surprise you with some fun facts, even though you are quite knowledgeable about this plant. But we'll see. I'm not confident I can.
Oh, I'm very excited. I hope that you can.
Wonderful. Well, let's start off just like any normal episode with why this plant is meaningful to you personally.
Sure. Okay. Well, it's funny. Violets have been my favorite flower since I was very young. And I'm not exactly sure as to why, but I mean, going back to, I don't know, like fourth grade, when we had to do our first nonfiction report, I chose violets. I just have always loved them. And I do think, though, that some of it probably has to do with my dad's influence, because it was the favorite flower of his favorite aunt. So he had an aunt who was, well, I never met her. She was born about 100 years before I was born, but she was his father's sister, and she was epileptic.
Hmm.
And at that time, of course, being a woman, you didn't have a whole lot of options.
Hmm.
And then you add on epilepsy, and then, you really have no options. So
Mhm.
marriage wasn't an option for her. Working, of course, wasn't an option. So her brother took her into his family, and she helped raise my father. And my
Ah.
father adored her. But one day they couldn't find her. And so they looked all through the house and finally ran outside, and they found her lying dead in a bed of violets with a
Oh, wow.
little bouquet of violets in her
Oh my
hand.
gosh.
So, I'd always heard that story, and it was, I find it really touching. I
Hmm.
think for him, it was a little bit, kind of traumatic and heartbreaking, but I just find it just, I don't know, it's just, it was very touching, and of course very Victorian too. I just have this kind of vision of her lying there. But anyway, that was obviously her favorite flower, and I think through those stories and kind of his adoration of her, it all eventually transferred onto the flower. And so yeah, it's my favorite flower.
Wow. There's very tragic, but also you said there's like there's a poetry in that
Yeah,
image,
yeah,
and also just like, I don't, I mean, I don't know what to say, but what a touching story. And
yeah.
I do think plants have this really amazing ability to like transfer their joy across generations, which is really something that's come up on the show a lot. And
Mhm.
that is really interesting that you say that. It also reminds me, I'm trying to find now here. I think there's a quote from Shakespeare about violets that I saw that I didn't write down, which I think it's from Hamlet. I'm trying to find it. Audience, excuse me while I Google this. Um,
Oh, that's funny because
I'd give you some violets, but they are all dried up when my father died. Is a quote. I think who said that? I think it
oh,
might be Ophelia who says that.
very interesting.
And
Wow.
so yeah. Um,
Well,
anyway,
it's interesting you
yeah.
say that
Wow.
because I actually have a quote from Shakespeare too. It is different, and it actually is associated with pansies, which are, of course, in the violet family. They are a viola, but Shakespeare did refer to violets quite often
Mm,
in his plays. So, yeah. Well, that's interesting.
interesting. Yeah.
I had not heard that one before. That's pretty cool. I love it.
I'm pretty sure I'm not audience if I'm wrong about this because I'm only looking at some snippets. I think it's from that famous scene where Ophelia is giving flowers to people and telling them
Mm.
what they're for, and I think that's maybe the kicker of that speech. Um, but yeah, really, wow, what a moving story and a really interesting way to acquire your favorite flower and have that connection to history and family is really really moving.
Yeah, yeah, it is. I like I said, I don't know if that's exactly why, but I feel certain that, as you say, there was sort of this transference, and flowers often do that. So,
Mm,
so yeah, it's always been a favorite.
very interesting. And what you just mentioned, I only literally learned yesterday that pansies are also in the same genus as violets. I did not know that until I was
That's
trying to
right.
get some. So that's really fascinating to me too. I didn't realize. I guess there's some. Many of them are hybrids. I guess is what I
That's
read.
right.
Yeah.
Yep, yep. As a matter of fact, we really didn't even have pansies until like around 1812. So they
Whoa,
are, yeah, yeah.
a modern invention.
It's a modern invention. That's exactly right. So, yeah, there's kind of an interesting story there because I guess this woman by the name of Mary Bennett and her gardener set out to cultivate them. Well, cultivate the wild Johnny Jump Up. So they started to do that, and then sort of like pansy fever swept through several nations. And within a few years, there were all these pansy societies popping up all over. Like in 1845, there was the Scottish Pansy Society. So it's kind of interesting that, yeah, they just really took everybody by surprise and people loved them. And
Wow, I
that,
love that. There's, I feel like I feel like we're not as people involved in enough flower based societies.
That's
That
right.
is like so nice. Yeah,
Yeah, isn't that
yeah,
sweet? Yeah, I
yeah,
mean, apparently they were everywhere, these little societies, which is very, very cute. I love that.
yeah. So you mentioned something before. Now, I think there's probably you mentioned Johnny Jump Up, and you mentioned Shakespeare, who was much earlier than 1800. So I assume he wasn't writing about the pansies that are like the cult.
Right,
Yeah, that's an
right.
interesting historical
Yes.
thing. I want to get to the bottom of now.
No, that's an excellent point, and I thought of that too, and I think they were referring to the Johnny Jump Up,
Hmm.
which is a very close relative or cousin, I guess you would say, of violets. But in their original form, the Johnny Jump Up was quite fragrant, just like the European violet is very
Hmm.
fragrant. And so the word pansy actually comes from the French word penser, which means to think. And
Ah, yeah.
apparently, pansies were, or Johnny Jump Ups, as we know them, were supposed to sort of help your lover think of you. So they were often given as love tokens.
Ah.
But it made me wonder too, because I don't know if this is true for you, but very often, well, I think it's true for everybody, but fragrance and scent, has this incredible ability to transport us through time, right?
Hmm.
And to
Hmm.
make us think of things that, you know, we weren't thinking of before we smelled the flower. So I wonder too if that association with thought actually has to do with the fact that it's a fragrant flower. So
Hmm.
anyway, I
Very,
don't know.
very interesting. Yes, that makes a lot of sense to me.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we've been talking about pansies. Maybe we should get into the
The
violet, like that.
violet.
What I mean, what is the most violet of the violets?
Okay, so I think the violet that most people associate with is the Viola odorata.
Yeah. Okay. And that is like the when you think of like I said, I don't have a lot of experience with violets, but like when I think of violets, I think of like Europe, and I think of
Yes.
and that is that like the European violet that like comes to my brain that when I think of the image of a violet.
That's exactly right. And that's the very fragrant one. And perfumes, of course, were made out of violets. And very often people carried them and ate them because the fragrance would sweeten their breath. So
Hmm.
you can even still find today, there are these little candies that are made that are violet flavored candies. They're more common in Europe, but there is a company still here in the US that makes it. I think. I can't remember the name of the company. Maybe Highlands? Oh, I can't remember. Anyway.
We're not afraid to tell the audience to Google it on this show. So
Oh, okay.
yeah, yeah, feel free to Google it. I'm going to do that later for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think that is definitely the violet that most people, sort of associate with. Of course, we do have native violets here in North America.
I was
Um,
wondering that.
yeah, definitely. But they are not fragrant here. So
Interesting.
yeah, they don't have a fragrance.
Huh. Interesting. Well, let's talk about the this European violet. What
Sure.
what are some fun facts and dazzling details about this flower?
Okay, very cool. Well, we get the word violet from the Greeks. There is an origin story about the violet, and the story goes that Zeus was wandering around one day and noticed a beautiful maiden by the name of Io. And so, he pursued her and they developed a relationship, but in order to keep her from the jealous eyes of his wife Hera, he turned her into a cow. And
Gross.
yeah, that was an
I was
interesting
expecting the flower
choice.
part. I was expecting because Zeus turned out a bunch of people into flowers. I feel like I was expecting him to turn her into a violet, but no, a cow.
A cow, yeah.
Okay.
So then she was forced to eat all kinds of grasses and forbs and things like that she wasn't used to. So she cried and cried, and Zeus took pity on her and turned her tears into violets so that she would have something sweet to eat.
Ah, very interesting.
Yeah.
Very interesting.
So that's supposedly the origin story of violets, and that's where we get the word violet because, within that word is the name Io.
I see. And I
Yeah.
wrote some stuff down about etymology with this Greek word io and ion, which maybe you know this. Can I transition to one of my? It's irrelevant. One of
Please
my
do.
my
Yeah.
things that maybe surprise you. So I was trying to figure that out, and that you totally clarified this. Yes, violet, and at some point somebody. So I was reading the word viola, which is a genus. There's a Latin word that means uh, joy or victory, and I think the instrument is also the viola, comes from that. And so there's probably some etymological link between io, because there's the Greek word for the flower was io or eon or eo, something like that. But then with the Romans, this word to have joy, I think maybe there's a merging there with the v, because the German word was vitula, I guess. And so I'm just speculating here. This joining of the io with the vitula, you get a vio.
Very interesting. Okay, you have surprised me, Steve.
So
That is a dazzling detail. I love it.
but even more surprising, I when I was looking into this, and maybe you know this, is the word iodine is related to the chemical, the element iodine is related to violets in the fact that pure iodine produces a purple vapor. And so when chemists were naming it back in the day, they called it iodine in reference to its color, which looks like the violet.
Oh my goodness.
So that io
You've
is
done it
related.
again. You've
Oh,
done it again.
wonderful,
I did
wonderful.
not know that. Oh, I
Wonderful.
love it. I love it. I
Great.
love it. That's great. That's so cool. Well, it's interesting that they're associated with joy because I do know that they also are associated with Aphrodite. And they were considered Aphrodite flower, or I should say, the Greeks called them Aphrodite flowers.
Oh, interesting.
I don't think they were her official flower, but they were referred to as Aphrodite flowers, and they were very often associated with love and used in love potions.
Oh.
Yeah, and that may have something to do with the fact that the leaves are heart shaped.
That makes sense.
So a little bit of sort of doctrine of signatures, I guess. But they also have a long sort of medicinal use for heart conditions.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Tell me more about that.
Science has recently confirmed that they are, or I should say, the leaves of a violet plant are a diuretic. So I think it's kind of interesting when you think about sort of very often heart conditions, there are problems associated with water retention. Like when you think about, congestive heart failure and things like that, there's very often a lot of water retention. So the fact that they're a diuretic, may at some point have been kind of associated with that. But they were also used for grief, for helping people alleviate grief, and as well as strengthening the heart. So you just think about love and grief and all of those kinds of things that are heart related. So it's kind of interesting.
Yeah, a flower of the heart for sure.
Flower of the heart, right?
So you've mentioned this a few different times in passing, but I don't. Well, I guess I knew that violet syrup was a thing, but I don't really think I put violets in the class of like edible flowers, but they are, I guess.
Oh yes, absolutely.
Can we talk about that? What's
Sure.
their uses? Yeah.
Yeah. So, in Sweden, it is considered good luck to eat flowers in the springtime. So a lot of people used to just wander around and nibble on violets, and of course they're a spring bloomer. They're one of the first blooms of spring. And as I mentioned before, they're very highly perfumed, so often people would eat them to freshen their breath as well. Also, people for centuries have done what's called sugaring violets, which is where you can dip them in a little bit of egg and then coat them in sugar, and it sort of preserves the flower. And you often see them on little cakes and things like that, or you can just sort of eat them
Hmm.
straight as a little sweet treat. But yeah, so the flowers have been used for that purpose, but the plant itself has been used medicinally for centuries. As a matter of fact, the Romans, now I don't know if this is true or not, but the Romans believed that violets would help you avoid a hangover.
Oh.
So, yeah, so they would create this very special violet wine that they
Oh.
would drink. Yeah, and they would also scatter the violet flowers all over the banquet tables in order for people to just kind of nibble on the flowers as they were drinking their wine to avoid hangovers.
I'm gonna
So,
try that. I'm
yeah.
gonna add that to my list. You gotta do it before or during you're drinking.
Not
Is that
really sure, but
okay?
you could experiment.
I'll experiment. I'll let you know. I gotta find a good source of a lot of violets next time I go
Yeah,
out on the town. Um,
absolutely.
yeah, that's really fascinating. Um, do you have like a regular practice of using violets in some kind of edible manner?
Well, I do. I have made like a violet syrup in the past, which is where you just take the violets and you can, put them in like a sugar water, and the actual color of the violet will infuse into the sugar water. So you get this beautiful purple syrup. And I've also used them to make vinegar,
Oh,
violet
cool.
vinegar. Yeah. So yeah, there are lots of ways to use it. And then the leaves themselves are actually really, really high in vitamin A and vitamin C, even more so than, say, spinach.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So I
You
will
just throw them in a salad,
yeah,
or
you
you
can
cook
just
them,
throw
or
them in a salad. Throw them in a
mm,
salad. Yeah.
mm,
And I recommend doing that early in the spring when they're first
uh-huh.
coming out, because they can get tougher as
Hmm.
the season goes on. And the leaves are very sort of mucilaginous. So,
Oh,
yeah, so they were often used, well, to create a cough syrup, and also to, particularly with children, to help them with constipation.
oh,
So
interesting.
apparently
Huh.
that helps kind of clear you out. And I also read that early on in the African American community, they were referred to as wild okra, and were
Ah.
used for in soups and stews to kind of thicken things, much like okra does for, say, a roux or something like
When you
that.
said
So,
mucilaginous, I was about to ask, could you use it as soup? Because I was thinking
yeah,
sassafras leaves, which
yeah,
which
like,
which
which is, yes, like
also
that's
used a similar way. Yeah.
exactly, yeah,
Super interesting. Yeah,
yeah.
I'll have to think about that. I've just been experimenting with the sassafras. The what do they call that? I'm blanking on the word for what powdered sassafras leaves is called.
Oh,
Uh,
what is it called? It's a
Google.
special term.
Yeah, sassafras powder is called filet. That's right.
Filet, that's
Yeah,
right.
because
It's
it's
used in
that's the
gumbo.
yeah, and it's the French word for string because it gets very stringy. Is where
Mm.
the filet comes from. But I've been experimenting with that. I have some Cajun roots, and we were roux gumbo people. We didn't use filet, but I
Oh,
have some
okay.
sassafras around here, and I've experimented with it. But in a pinch, you can try to make a gumbo
With violet
with
leaves.
violet leaves.
Yeah.
Interesting. Cool. That's very cool. Now, like I said, I don't have a lot of experience with violets. I also feel like my sense of smell is my weakest sense. And describing smells on a podcast is hard, and maybe taste. But maybe could you explain a little bit, like what do they smell like? What makes them interesting with both smell and taste? Like, I don't know if you can put that into words or not. That might be a too hard of a challenge, but give it a shot.
Well, I will say I've never actually tasted a European violet,
Oh,
so
interesting.
I
Oh,
can't quite talk about that. Although I do have, remember the ant I was talking about
uh huh.
earlier, the
Yes.
great ant?
Uh
I
huh.
do have her perfume bottle, which is a violet perfume,
Wow. Oh, wow.
and it still smells today. So if you take the top off, you can smell it, and it is a very, well, it's very strong, but not in a pungent way. It's sweet. It's a really
Mm.
sweet fragrance. So
Wow.
it's like a, I don't know. It's honestly, it really does lend itself to like a almost like a candy flavor.
Mm. Oh,
So
wow.
yeah, that may be part of why that sort of evolved as a tradition. But
That bottle's
yeah,
super cool. I know the audience can't see this, but could you hold that up for me again?
sure.
I mean, how old is that bottle? That is super cool.
Oh, let's see
It probably
if
doesn't have a
there's a
date on
date
that. I
on there.
did,
There's
yeah.
no date on there, but I mean, she was this. I mean, definitely, she was born 100 years before me. So
Can you read what the
yeah,
text on
it
the bottle?
says Richard Hudnut in New York, and it says Violet Sec, Violet Water. Um, but this is, I will say, extremely strong for being violet water. I mean, there's nothing really left in the bottle
Uh-huh.
except you can kind of see this like residue at the
Hmm.
bottom, and
Hmm.
that is what is still so incredibly fragrant.
Wow.
Yeah, I wish you could smell it. It's
I
really
know.
cool.
So, yeah, that's we haven't got that technology yet.
Yeah, not quite yet.
Very, very interesting. Okay, another one of my maybe I can surprise you facts. I didn't know this until recently, but it was super interesting to me. That apparently violets, many of the violas, and I guess European violets, have the ability to temporarily desensitize your nose. So if you smell a violet too much, you can stop smelling it,
That's right. Yeah, the
which is
chemical in that fragrance is, yeah, it has that effect on you.
and this is where maybe I just so I didn't surprise you with the fact, but the chemical is called ionone,
Ionone.
which is
Yeah.
a ketone. My wife's a chemist, so I can throw out some
Ah,
chemistry words here and there.
I love
But
it.
yes, that is super interesting. That it desensitizes the receptors of your nose, and so it's a smell that you can't overindulge in, I guess, because it's like nature's way of being like, okay, you've had it, you've had enough. I
Isn't
think that
that
was
cool?
very
So it almost
fascinating.
like numbs your nose, is what you're
Yeah,
saying. Oh,
yeah,
wow.
it desensitizes the receptors of your nose so that your nose can no longer smell. I don't know if it's just that smell or if it's like all smells temporarily or like it
Hmm.
desensitizes those. But that's pretty interesting. This individual compound called ionone, named after Io. Chemists like doing that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Uh, very, very interesting. But yeah, I didn't know that. So I have to try that again with the violets. But I guess I have to find the European violet because you said the ones here don't
Yeah,
have a smell.
they do not have a smell or a particularly strong flavor here. No.
Interesting. Um, what else do you have on your list there? Fun facts and dazzling details.
Well, I do have another story about violets associated with Napoleon.
Oh,
Yeah,
I did not expect that.
right. So it was actually Napoleon's favorite flower, the
Hmm.
violet was, and he was referred to as Corporal Violet during his time.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, yeah.
That's
And
adorable.
his supporters would wear little violets in their buttonholes.
Oh wow.
Um, yeah. Now, the reason why violets were his favorite flower has to do with his wife Josephine.
Hmm.
So the story goes that Napoleon met Josephine one evening at a ball, and instead of wearing, you know, jewelry and necklaces made of, gemstones, Josephine had fashioned a little garland of violets, and she was wearing that, and he was enchanted.
Hmm.
So their romance ensued, and they were married just a few months later, actually, much to the dismay of his family because she was 6 years older than he was and a widow with children. So that was,
Scandalous.
yeah, verboten. But he didn't care. He married her anyway. And so she wore a dress that was embroidered with violets and carried a little bouquet of violets. And she apparently said, from this day forward, I want violets on my anniversary, you know, until the day I die. So that's what she got. He sent her a bouquet of violets every year on their wedding anniversary, even though they were divorced at a certain point. Yeah, so I can't remember exactly how many years they were married for quite some time, but at a certain point, it was clear that she was not going to bear an heir. So he divorced her, and he married, and I quote, a womb, right, in order to have an heir. But he never stopped loving Josephine, even though he divorced her, and continued, as I said, to send her violets every year on their wedding anniversary. And when she died, he planted violets on her grave. And a few years later, when he died, they found some of those violets tucked into a little locket that he wore close to his heart. So, yeah, kind of
Very
a real sentimental side he had, which nobody
I feel
really
like
thinks about.
that's a common story a little bit, where these, like, macho men are often compensating for their super tenderness, and there's like the toxic masculinity of like what you're supposed to do. Yeah, like he can't express himself, so I'm going to take over all of Europe. Right? Like,
Exactly. I'm going to conquer the world.
Yeah, it's probably a lot of motivation. So that's really interesting. I wonder what she thought about getting the bouquets like after their divorce. Was she charmed, or was she like, "Come on, Napoleon, like again"? I know I said it, but
my understanding is that she now. Okay, here's my understanding. Neither one of them were ever faithful in the marriage.
Okay.
But they adored each other, and they continued to adore each other until the end. So kind of an interesting story in that regard, because, we all want that sort of fairy tale story, but it doesn't always work out that way, right?
Yeah.
So,
yeah. Very interesting.
Yeah. And I'd always thought of him as, kind of a jerk, but this changed a little bit of
interesting.
Yeah.
That's pretty fascinating. I never knew. I mean, I feel like that's also something that doesn't happen now, of like a strong man being referred to as a flower, right?
Right. Yeah. Corporal Violet.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then when he became there was what he was exiled, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so at that point, apparently, violets were sold in bouquets on the street all around Paris and France and all over Europe. But in France in particular, once he was exiled, well, you couldn't find a violet anywhere.
Interesting. They're like,
we're done with violets. Right. Yeah.
You can tell that you were like not a great guy if you ruined flowers for a whole country.
Exactly.
Wow. Oh my
gosh.
Such
a good point. Yeah. So, I mean, so if you were kind of, as I said, his supporters used to wear violets in their buttonholes. So from that point forward, like, you were not caught with the violet, because
the flowers were associated with
right.
him.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
You would, get beheaded, or, be considered a traitor. So he kind of ruined
him.
that. Yeah.
Wow, that is some fascinating flower history. Like you can't, wow. Yeah. It's interesting how so much history is so intertwined with plants that we kind of overlook. And that's one I had no clue about. That was really interesting. Wow.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's interesting too, because most people, or I should say, many gardeners in particular, consider violets just kind of a common weed. Yet there is this incredibly rich and long history associated with them, both culturally and medicinally. So it is interesting. Yeah.
Very interesting. Well, on that point, I said earlier that I realized that these flowers are meaningful to me. And that's because my daughter was born in February, and that is the birth month flower. It's violets, and I didn't
That's
know that. I never thought
right.
about that, but so now there's this thing. So
Aw.
my wife and I have, incorporated violet colors into a lot of things she's wearing, and it's one of those things that I wonder if she's going to grow up really thinking violets are great, and the color is really great because of our influence. But yeah, I never even thought about violets, but now it has a special moment because it's her birth flower.
Isn't that sweet? I
Yeah,
love that. And isn't it wonderful that you're incorporating some of that into her world? That's really charming. I love
yeah.
it.
So that's it. Okay, I think I have one. I have one more maybe surprising fact for you, and then maybe anything else we want to close with. But speaking of the color violet, which is interesting, and this is away from the flower a little bit. But the color violet, of course, is because of the flower. We call the color violet. But I was curious a little bit about what's the difference between violet and purple?
Hmm.
And some people might say that they're the same, two different words for the same thing. But I guess more scientifically, violet is the color in the visible light spectrum that is the furthest towards the ultraviolet. Actually, ultraviolet's also a pretty cool word. It's above violet. It's the violet we cannot see. But
Mm.
so violet refers to specific single wavelengths of light that are in that range just after blue in the rainbow. Whereas purple is a combination of violet, blue, and red, and any combination of those, like blending together, makes purples. But violets are
Ah.
specific single wavelengths in that part of the spectrum.
Oh, that's so interesting. I'd never thought of it in those terms before. That's amazing.
Yeah,
Um, yeah, so violet is actually it's it's a certain kind of light.
it's a pure wavelength of light. It's a pure color. It's a color that our eyes perceive specifically, as opposed to being a blend of different colors of light, which a lot of the colors we see are that.
I see.
But if you look at a rainbow and you look at that edge after blue and you see the
Mhm.
purple down there,
Mhm. Mhm.
um, that is true violet. And those are specific wavelengths. I have it written down here. Between 380 and 435 nanometers is what is scientifically defined as violet.
Wow.
Yeah.
That is a dazzling fact. I love it.
Yeah,
Oh
and
my
Isaac
gosh.
Newton is the one who defined that range, but we've been talking about violet as a color for longer than that. He's just the one who realized, oh, it's one of the fundamental colors that we can
Mm.
perceive.
Oh, wow.
Yeah,
That's
but
really, really
I
cool.
didn't think until I said it that ultraviolet is this whole cool thing of like like that's the thing we talk about all the time, ultraviolet radiation,
That's
right? And
right.
like you
That's
get
right.
sunburns from you get burned from too much violet. It's the violet that we can't see.
Yeah, that is so cool. Yeah, you say it so often, you just don't even realize the association,
Yeah.
right? That's really cool. Oh my
Yeah, it's the
goodness.
violet beyond the violet we can see. So anyway, that's what I have as far as surprising facts about violet. And I cheated a little bit because I got actually away from the flower. I
Oh,
went to
that's
the
okay.
yeah, right. I went to the other things like the iodine gas and the violet, the color and things like that.
Oh, but
That
it's
was
all
that's my cheat.
associated. I
Yeah,
think that's so fun. Oh my
yeah.
goodness.
Do you
That's
have any
wonderful.
fun facts or details we missed on your list there that we really need to talk about violets?
No, I don't think so. I think we covered most of it. I guess the only other thing I would say is we sort of started with Shakespeare, so
Mm.
I'll maybe end with
I
Shakespeare.
totally forgot that you had a
Yeah.
Shakespeare quote to share. Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely.
So, and again, this is specifically about pansies, but we're going to we're going to say they're all in the same family, which of course
Yes.
they are,
Yes,
which they
indeed.
are. So, Shakespeare does in A Midsummer Night's Dream. There's a quote that says the juice of it, referring to the pansy, on sleeping eyelids laid, will make a man or woman madly dote on the next live creature it sees. So that is when I guess Oberon put some pansy juice on Titania's eyelids, and that's why she fell in love with the ass. So,
Uh,
yeah. And, you know, what's interesting is that speaks to that really long tradition of violets being used in association with love or love potions.
mm,
So, yeah, apparently Shakespeare was very much aware of that and used it in A Midsummer Night's Dream.
And to his own Shakespearean comical interpretation, I guess. Which is really good at taking those things and twisting
and twisting it and turning it into some wonderful, comedic moment.
Indeed. But before we go, Nina, I understand that you recently have launched a new Substack. I wanted to give you a chance to chat about that before we go.
Yeah, that's right. I'm really excited. So I have a Substack. It's called Flora and Forage, and it's a newsletter for plant passionate people.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
And what kind? I think I have an earlier incarnation of that I've been getting. What's new about this, and what can people expect to learn from you in the Substack?
Right. Well, Flora and Forage will be a newsletter that focuses on all kinds of flower-powered fun, right? I mean, I talk about foraging, I talk about flower folklore, as well as different kind of plant identification tips, all kinds of things like that. So if you're into plants, it might be something that you would find interesting.
Well, I'm definitely signed up and looking forward to it. An audience, if you haven't seen Nina's stuff out there, she's very entertaining, but also a font of knowledge about all sorts of plant stuff. So it's going to be a really interesting way to learn more. And I'm sure there'll probably be some violet content in there, violet content in there at some time, point, amongst other things.
Absolutely, yes.
Well, wonderful, Nina. Thank you so much for joining me on this episode of Rootbound.
Oh, Steve, this has been so much fun. I really appreciate the invitation, and it has been wonderful to talk about violets with you.
Violet, violet, you're the fairest flower to me. Violet, violet, emblem of fraternity. With your perfume, memories come of Sigma Alpha Epsilon. Fairest flower beneath the sun, my violet.
Steve here, back in the forest, and it is actually raining now. You can hear that it got a little bit more intense. But I'm still not really getting wet because of all the leaves, so thank you trees, thank you leaves for keeping me dry. But what a wonderful conversation with Nina about violets. And now I'm going to attempt to connect violets to the pawpaw. And I'm going to do that through literature. When we were speaking with Nina, we talked a lot about literature and violets, and we heard some stuff from William Shakespeare about violets, and that had me thinking, what other kinds of poems and literature are out there that have to do with violets? And I came upon this poem by Emily Dickinson, and it's called Almost, with an exclamation point. And I'm going to read that now. Almost within my reach, I could have touched, I might have chanced that way. Soft sauntered through the village, sauntered soft away. So unsuspected violets within the fields lie low, too late for striving fingers that passed an hour ago. Now, what does that have to do with pawpaws? As you might know from the pawpaw episode, pawpaws are only ripe for a very short window. And today I did not collect any pawpaws because it turns out I was a bit too early and they're not ripe yet. I think with a lot of things in wild plants and plants in general, they have this very specific time window and this ephemeralness that means that you need to be ready to make a choice, to see them, to gather them, to be with them. And I think that poem illustrates it very nicely. And I think that idea of having to make a choice and maybe the regret you get when you don't make the correct choice and you miss something is a very common experience, and I think something related to the violets in the poem and my experience today with the pawpaws that I was unable to collect. So yes, I'm looking forward to next year when I can find the pawpaws again and they don't slip through my striving fingers. And with that, let's just end the episode. Thanks for listening. My guest on this episode of Rootbound was Nina Vedito. Nina is a longtime forager, explorer, plant lover, and art maker living in the Blue Ridge Mountains. You can sign up for her newsletter, Flora and Forage, at blueridgebotanic.com, and there will be links in the show notes. Rootbound is hosted by a guy who hopes he never ruins a flower for a whole country, Steve Ellington. Music by Christian Kriegesgota. Fake ads by David Alani. Rootbound is a podcast about plants for when you're stuck inside, but if you can go outside, make sure to put on some sunscreen so you don't get burnt by that violet we can't see.
What's that smell? It's fragrance!